There are certain figures in history who are remembered not only for what they did, but for the question of how their minds worked. Adolf Hitler is one of those figures. So the real question is, how does a person reach that point? This video is not made to justify or glorify anyone. It exists for one reason only: to understand how human psychology, under certain conditions, can take a very dark path. Let's begin with something important. No one is born as one of the most hated figures in history. Psychology consistently shows that personality is shaped by a combination of biological predispositions and environmental influences. So, what happened in this particular case? Let's go back to the early 1900s. A child growing up in Austria, seemingly ordinary from the outside, but internally, things were more complex. Hitler's father was known to be strict, authoritarian, and highly controlling. In psychological terms, this type of parenting is often described as authoritarian. Children raised in such environments tend to develop in one of two ways. They either become overly submissive, or they develop suppressed anger beneath the surface. In this case, many historians and psychologists believe the latter played a role. His relationship with his mother, however, was very different. It was emotionally intense and deeply attached. This kind of dynamic can create what psychologists call insecure attachment. On one side, fear. On the other, dependency. These contradictions can leave lasting marks on emotional development. And those marks often lead to one key trait: a need for control. When someone grows up in an environment where they feel powerless, they may later seek extreme levels of control to compensate. Now let's move forward. As a young adult, Hitler aspired to become an artist, but he was rejected by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. This moment is psychologically significant. There is a concept known as narcissistic injury. It occurs when someone who believes they are exceptional is confronted with rejection from reality. That clash can be deeply destabilizing. Rejection is not just failure. It can feel like a direct attack on identity. Combined with poverty, isolation, and repeated setbacks, this experience may have intensified underlying psychological tensions. So what do people do in such situations? Some take responsibility. Others look for something or someone to blame. This is known as externalization. Instead of facing internal shortcomings, the individual projects them outward. And this is where a dangerous pattern begins: the creation of an enemy. The human brain prefers simple explanations for complex problems, but sometimes that simplification distorts reality. Many researchers suggest that these cognitive patterns played a role in shaping Hitler's worldview. However, individual psychology alone is not enough to explain what followed. We also need to consider group psychology. Humans have a fundamental need to belong. Being part of a group creates identity and security. But there is a darker side to this. When groups form around strong ideologies, individuals can adopt beliefs and behaviors they would normally reject. This has been demonstrated repeatedly in social psychology. Then comes power. Power doesn't just provide control. It can also distort perception. Over time, it may create a mindset where the individual begins to believe, "I cannot be wrong." This can lead to isolation, paranoia, and an increasing disconnect from reality. In Hitler's later years, his growing distrust, his isolation from others, and his rigid decision-making patterns are often interpreted through this psychological lens. But we need to be very clear about something. Trying to understand such figures does not mean justifying them. Science seeks to understand, because understanding is the first step toward prevention. If we ignore these processes, we increase the risk of similar patterns emerging again in different forms. So perhaps the most important question is this: was it only the individual, or was it also the environment, the society, and the conditions surrounding him? And maybe the most uncomfortable truth is this: transformations like this are not as distant as we might think, which is exactly why understanding psychology is not just about the past, but about protecting the future. To understand this more clearly, we need to go deeper into how personality develops under pressure. In psychology, there is a concept known as the authoritarian personality. This concept was studied extensively in the mid-20th century. Individuals with this personality structure tend to show a strong respect for authority, rigid thinking patterns, and a tendency to divide the world into us and them. This binary way of thinking simplifies reality, but it also makes it easier to justify extreme actions. Another important factor is identity. When individuals feel a lack of personal identity, they often try to compensate by attaching themselves to larger, more powerful identities. This could be a nation, an ideology, or a movement. In such cases, the individual no longer acts purely as an individual. They begin to act as a representative of something greater. And this is where moral boundaries can begin to shift. Because when actions are framed as serving a larger cause, they can feel justified even when they are not. We should also consider the role of economic and social instability. Periods of uncertainty create fear, and fear increases the human desire for order and control. In such environments, people are more likely to support strong, decisive leaders, even if those leaders promote extreme ideas. This is not unique to one place or one time in history. It is a recurring pattern. Now let's look at cognitive biases. Human thinking is not perfectly rational. We rely on mental shortcuts, known as biases. One of these is confirmation bias. This is the tendency to favor information that supports existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Over time, this creates a closed loop of thinking. The individual becomes more certain, less open to change, and increasingly disconnected from alternative perspectives. Another bias is scapegoating. When people experience frustration or failure, they may project that frustration onto a specific group. This simplifies complex problems into a single target. And once that target is defined, it becomes easier to direct anger toward it. From a psychological perspective, this is not about logic. It is about emotional regulation. But when combined with influence and power, these mechanisms can have devastating consequences. We should also briefly touch on the role of communication. Charismatic communication plays a powerful role in shaping perception. When someone speaks with confidence, certainty, and emotional intensity, people are more likely to be influenced. This effect becomes even stronger in large groups, because in crowds, individual responsibility tends to decrease. This is known as de-individuation. People feel less personally accountable for their actions, and as a result, they may act in ways they normally wouldn't. Now combine all of these elements: early emotional conflict, identity struggles, rejection and frustration, cognitive biases, group influence, and access to power. Individually, each of these factors is manageable, but together, they can create a very different outcome. This is why psychological analysis is never about a single cause. It is about patterns, and patterns, when repeated under the right conditions, can lead to predictable outcomes. So when we examine figures like Hitler, we are not just looking at a person. We are looking at a system of interacting psychological processes, and that system is what truly matters. Because systems can repeat themselves, not in identical ways, but in similar patterns. Which brings us back to the present. The goal of studying psychology is not to label individuals as good or bad. It is to recognize warning signs: rigid thinking, extreme group division, dehumanization of others, and blind loyalty to authority. These are not just historical concepts. They are psychological patterns that can appear anywhere, and the earlier they are recognized, the easier they are to prevent. So in the end, this is not just a story about one person. It is a reflection of how human psychology works under pressure, and perhaps more importantly, a reminder of why awareness matters.